So now let's cover the ID. So an ID is just a way of talking about a specific element. So let's say we want to talk about button 1. If we want to go into our style sheet and let's say we want to change the color to be blue, basically how do we say button 1 is blue? So we need a way of saying button 1. Let's say we want to go into JavaScript and let's change the name of button 1 to button 2. How are we going to talk about this particular button? So you'll see that the button 1 here doesn't actually really mean anything. That's just what the user sees. So you could even change that while your program is running. What you want is a nice hard ID that is always going to stay consistent with this element. So how we're going to do it is we're actually going to go inside of the tab here and we're going to give it an ID. So we're going to say ID equals, and you can call that whatever you want. I'm going to say button 1. So now we know that button 1 right here is what this element is. So if we go into our style sheet, we're actually going to talk about button 1, right? We're not going to talk about button 1 because that is just the name of it. That doesn't have any meaning. If we go into my script, again, we're going to talk about button 1. That's how we're going to access it. So whatever ID you give it in here is going to stay consistent for those two sheets. And you can give any of these elements an ID. So I could give an input an ID. Let's say input 1, and maybe div, I'll call div 1. Oops, got rid of the div. ID equals div 1. There we go. So now we have a way of talking about this button, this input, and this div. Now if you have a couple different buttons, you can give them each an ID. So let's just say button 1, 2, and 3 for simplicity. So even though all these names are the same, they're all called button 1, this is what matters. So button 1, button 2, button 3. So our scripts are going to know we're talking about either this one, or this one. So that is just a handy way of tagging stuff. Now there's another way we can add kind of like a group ID. So if we want to talk about a whole bunch of different things at once, what we can do is we can say class equals, and maybe button group 1, something like that. So maybe the first two buttons have to do with button group 1, but the third one is its own little thing. So I could put that in here, and these are both going to have the class button group 1. So they're both kind of the same. And what you might use that for is, let's say you go into your style sheet and you say button group 1, maybe the color is blue. So you'd say for all of these buttons, we're going to make the color blue. So these first two would be blue and the third one wouldn't have any style. So that's just kind of the thing you might use a class for. It's also handy for arranging stuff around and all that, but we'll get into that later. Now you can also have an ID and a class. So you could say ID equals button 1. So it could have both, right? It could have the ID for this specific button, and then this button is also part of button group 1. But we're going to go over events now real quick. So we have a button, we have a couple buttons actually. Let's get rid of two of those there, and I'll just move this around a bit. Okay, so we've actually kind of declared a button. We've said in HTML, there's a button called button 1, and it's right over here. Now if I just click that, nothing is going to happen. So we can actually call an event in HTML and say, basically, when this button is clicked, go do something. Now HTML is not going to have logic inside of the language. What we're actually going to do is say, go over to my script, so handle this on JavaScript. So I do that like this. I'd say onClick equals, then whatever the function you want to call is. So maybe my function, like that. So what this is going to do is it's going to say when the onClick event is called, do my function. So my function is going to be written and handled by JavaScript. So you'd actually come in here, you'd say my function, and you'd write whatever you want in here. So everything in here is going to be called when we do this onClick event, so whenever the button is clicked. So that's events, just really basically. That's just one event. There's a whole bunch of different ones in HTML, but we'll just do that one for now. And we'll leave it there.